I'm going to be talking with Chaplain Joe White, who is assigned to the VA in Lexington. And we're going to talk about a lot of topics related to our class, including some discussion about just war theory, some discussion about conscientious objector status, and some other things as well. So I'd like to start with welcoming Joe and asking him to just tell us a little bit about his journey to this day, his time in service, and a little bit about what he does at the VA, and then we'll get into some of the substantive issues.
All right. Thanks for having me. Again, I am Joe White, Chaplain Joe White at the Lexington VA. I guess I'll start with my military history. I enlisted in the Army Reserves when I was a junior in high school, and I was a unit armor supply specialist at that time. As a unit armorer, I fixed broken weapons. As a supply specialist, I issued equipment to people in my unit. And the unit that I was assigned to happened to be a drill sergeant unit. So eventually they convinced me to go to drill sergeant school, and I served as a drill sergeant or senior drill sergeant for about 7 years. During that time, that was all reserve components. So during that time, I graduated college, graduated the master's, and one of my company commanders said, Joe, why aren't you an officer? And so I applied and became an officer and was a company commander for the exact same company I had previously been a senior drill sergeant in. And did that for a few years. My MOS as an officer was as a signal officer, communications officer for those that are more familiar with that terminology. And so eventually I was transferred to a signal unit, and I was a detachment commander, and then personnel services and various different jobs within that signal company. But my deployment, I only had one deployment the entire time I was in the military, and that was as a FA-40, which is a space operations officer. And if you're thinking of space as an area around you, that's not what we're referring to. We're talking about outer space. So space-based assets, satellite technologies, whether that be ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, whether that's space weather, whether it's GPS, communication satellites, you name it. If it's a satellite, that was the area of work that we did for my deployment. And basically making sure that if those systems were out, then the command knew it and could adjust fire. That was my deployment. And then shortly after that, I transferred to the IRR, Individual Ready Reserve. And while I pursued my Master of Divinity and experience as a student chaplain, it fully intending becoming a military chaplain eventually. And I never became a military chaplain. I instead fell in love with the work at the VA hospital as a VA chaplain and pursued that route. And I've been doing VA chaplaincy now full time since 2015. So it's March of 15. So just over 6 years, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so that's my history, my military history, and part of my civilian VA history. I also, for part of that time, was an educator, a school teacher, public schools. Taught 1 year for Model Lab School here at the EKU campus, and 6 years at Berea Community School in Berea, Kentucky. And at both of those, coached cross country, track and field. And I, of course, am married, have a wife and 3 kids. And none of them are in the military, but lots of other family members are. So that's an introduction, I guess.
Well, thanks. And I'm going to guess that some of the work you do at the VA will kind of come out with some of the discussion we're going to have.
Sure,
here. So,
sure.
You'll be able to elaborate a little bit on that experience and in terms of these topics. I don't know where to begin. We have talked about several topics for today, and I guess, let's just begin with just war theory.
Okay.
By this point in the semester, the students would have read a little bit about just war theory, probably a total of 2 pages or so.
Okay.
And so they'll have some familiarity with some of the basic principles. They may not know a lot about them, but if you would just kind of address the notion of just war theory.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something that, personally, from my point of view, is something that has not been addressed or taught enough. And I feel particularly churches have some role and responsibility in introducing at least the concepts around just war theory,
mm-hmm.
so that this average civilian would have some sort of maybe moral reference as they decide who to vote for and what kinds of policies,
mm-hmm.
what kinds of foreign policies they would support.
Sure.
So if you just kind of elaborate on what you consider to be the more important aspects of just war theory and its role in our education, I guess.
Okay. Right. So just war theory is a very old concept. Though it wouldn't have been called that, it is in our biblical text. I mean, if you think about in Leviticus, we have rules for war where it says, that if you've just gotten married, you don't have to go to war. If you've just planted a vineyard, you don't have to go to war. If you're in war and you've taken over an area, then you're not supposed to destroy that person's vineyard. And there's rules about ethical treatment in war. So that's a very, very old concept. But just war theory itself has developed predominantly from St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, where he discusses sins against peace. And that's really, really what he was trying to talk about. And when he talks about sins against peace, he's talking about brawling, quarreling, schism, sedition, discord, divisiveness, and war. Those are the things that are sins against peace, according to St. Thomas. But when he developed that more, discussing war in particular, he says that there are certain times when war is appropriate. And while we have 7 components of just war theory now, originally he was discussing 3 particular areas that were important, he thought, in the idea of just war. And those are quite simply the idea of a legitimate authority, like not just anybody can wage war, but it had to be someone who was an authority figure, a king or a prince, or somebody who represented a large number of people. So it had to be a legitimate authority. It had to be a just cause. It had to be for a good trying to cause goodness, trying to promote peace. And then it had to be the right intention. So your motivation for the actual war couldn't be self-gain, couldn't be recuperation of losses, couldn't be recuperation of land. So it's really the idea of doing the right thing for a group of people, and usually that just cause would imply that it's stopping a more heinous crime. So if somebody is desolating a population, then it's appropriate to stop in or to stop them from doing that. Another theologian that you all probably or possibly have heard of is Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer has a great quote that he was explaining to his sister-in-law why he was a participant in the war effort. And his statement was, if I see a madman driving a car into a group of innocent bystanders, then I can't simply wait for the catastrophe and then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver. So for Bonhoeffer, the idea is that we have a responsibility not only to care for those who are wounded, but also to stop them from being wounded. And so that's another thought on just war. But just war has developed now to being the components of whether or not to wage the war, how to wage the war, and then how to repair the war or repair the damage done afterwards. So there's 7 components of just war now. And that's just cause, which is the same as when Thomas Aquinas said it, to correct a grave public evil. Comparative justice is the second, and that's the injustice that's suffered must outweigh the injustice suffered by the other party, which means I can't cause more pain to stop the pain. I have to be, it has to be a comparative measure. I can't make the world a worse place to make the world a better place. Legitimate authority, same as Aquinas would have said. It still has to be a recognized person of state, a recognized a nation against nation, not just somebody who decides they want to. And it can be a non-government entity if it's somebody who is reflecting the will of the people, but it has to be a legitimate authority, recognized person. Right intention, that's the promotion of peace rather than for personal gain or recuperation of losses. Probability of success. You may have all those other things, but if you know that you're going to lose and you're just going to cost more life, then it's not a just war. So it's got to be. It can't be an infeudal or a feudal. Cannot be feudal or disproportionate. And then it's a last resort. The idea is that you don't start with war and then back down to diplomacy. You start with diplomacy. If it doesn't work, then you work your way up to violence. And then the last of those 7 components is proportionality. Proportionality is basically the anticipated benefits outweigh the anticipated harm done. So you think that you can do something good without causing a greater degree of harm. Now, there's going to be harm. It's war. There's going to be loss of life. There's going to be loss of civilian life. But the idea is that you're protecting more than you are damaging. The end justifies the means, so to say. So that's the idea of going into a war. Does it meet those criteria? And if it does, all of those, it's not like pick and choose. It's if it meets all those, then the war can be deemed justified. Now, to saying that, there are large pockets within the faith community that say war is never justified. So don't think that this is the standard of all religious people. This is the standard of the just war theorists, those that agree that in sometimes there should be war. In the conduct of war, while conducting war, there's three things that you got to consider. One of them is distinction, and that's the distinction between enemy and civilians. You can't not everybody's a combatant, and not everybody should be treated as a combatant. And that's actually a confusing concept in many modern wars, because you have people who you don't know are combatants until it's already a threat. It's sometimes already too late. But distinction means that we only engage in an enemy, not non-combatants. Proportionality is the idea that civilian injuries can't outweigh military injuries. Like I can't attack something expecting that there'll be more civilian casualties than military casualties. And then military necessity, which is basically meaning use the minimum force necessary. It limits excessive and unnecessary deaths and excessive and unnecessary destruction. So those are while you're doing the war. And then post-war, afterwards, the first thing is just cause for termination. Why did the war stop? And the reason likely or hopefully will be that there's a vindication of rights. Whatever the atrocity was that caused the war to begin has been stopped. That's one reason. Or if you realize that your goals of having that vindication cannot be achieved, or cannot, then you can stop the war. Or if they cannot be achieved without excessive deaths, then you end the war, because you don't want to promote death without the idea or the possibility of victory. Right intention, in post-war right intention, that means that the war is concluded for the right reason. I've achieved my goals. It's not because somebody said, hey, you know what, we'll give you this land or this money or this whatever if you'll stop attacking us. It has to be that reason for going to war has ended. And then with that right intention means that if war crimes took place on either side, whether whichever the victor or the loser, if war crimes took place, they're equally investigated and prosecuted or yeah, and no revenge is being taken place in that respect. The third is public declaration and authority. So just like we said before, it has to be a legitimate authority that causes, that initiates the war. It has to be a legitimate authority that ends the war. You can't just be, well, we're calling it quits. It has to be a legitimate authority that says we're calling it quits, and it has to be announced. It's not just if you don't tell everybody the war ended. If you continue going on as if you were victorious even when you lost. I mean, and that's really we just the United States just added an additional national holiday, the Juneteenth Day, and really what that's about is where people were still being enslaved for years after the war had ended. So really, it was not announced accurately or appropriately in the South, and people continued as if they were victorious or still at war. So that would not be an example of just war done well. And then again, discrimination. Political leaders and military leaders are treated differently. Combatants and non-combatants are treated differently. If someone did military crimes or combatant crimes, then that's a different kind of treatment post-war than someone who was a political leader of their people or somebody who was a non-combatant. And then proportionality, again, resurfaces in that post-war idea. So that's the surrender is proportional to the rights violated. You don't, whatever rights were destroyed or whatever rights were being taken away, and that's why you started war, once those are restored, then that's proportionality. You can't say, well, I get so much more, or they get more freedoms, or they get more, whatever. You're not getting new land or new territory. It's not the victor goes the spoils kind of concept. It's a restoration of rights, not an expansion of rights. So that's really the components of pre-war, going to how to conduct it and how to end it appropriately by just war theory.
Well, that those points could fill up a whole semester.
Yeah, they could.
It's unbelievable as I think of what you were talking about, and just trying to relate it to my experience in Vietnam and the experience of these Middle East wars. And ironically, our attempt to get out of Afghanistan, so much of what you've outlined here is pertinent to all of that. But let me just ask you a few questions based on some of this, and maybe some of this will be a statement, and then asking for your reaction to it. The just cause is, for me, problem number one. Mm-hmm. And my impression is that in our country, we have been reduced to a couple of buzz terms, and we don't really know what they mean, but we accept them as a justification for going to war. Mm-hmm. And one of those buzz terms is national security. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that when one says this is in our national security, we must go to war, that the citizens should be going, well, what do you mean by national security? And in the case of Vietnam, it was a false assumption that communism was spreading, mm-hmm. And that if we didn't stop it in Vietnam, then it would be at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, mm-hmm. before we know it, mm-hmm. and it would be too late to save ourselves. Well, the assumption that communism was monolithic, and that the Vietnamese were just one more extension of Moscow was historically ignorant, frankly. Mm-hmm. So what do we do with? How do we personally maybe and collectively, how do we deal with this just cause when we're basically told you can't understand it? We have all the information, we have all the intelligence, and so you have to rely on us to tell you that this is in our national security. Let's go.
So it's a great question, and really it's an interesting one. It's one that's hard to answer because I think that if you were to look back at several of the recent wars or any of the wars post world wars, you would find a great many theologians who would say that is not a just war, and they would say it for a number of reasons. One, it's not a just cause. Two, is that legitimate authority really reflecting the will of the people? If the people you represent are protesting the war, then are they reflecting the will of the people? And is it right? Are they in that instance a legitimate authority? So that's a big room. I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying that's a big area of conversation and probably conflict. Compare that with the world wars, when the American populace was wanting to get into the wars before the nation was willing to do so. So that's and the atrocities that were being done were obvious and known and documented, and people wanted to be involved. American people were going to Canada so they could join the military to go fight that great evil. When that wasn't really the situation in some of those later developments, the later wars. So yeah, there is a strong argument against subsequent wars being just war. And then you have the idea of, well, then if I'm a warrior in a unjust war, what does that mean for me as a person of faith, or what does that mean for me as a patriot, or what does that mean for me as in a lot of different capacities, a lot of different areas of my own life.